right, so buckle up, everybody, because today we are diving into something pretty unique.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking about a digital encyclopedia,
Mm-hmm.
but not just any encyclopedia. This one's for an entire country.
Ambitious.
It's called Saudipedia.
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 Yeah.
And it's a project straight from the Saudi Arabian government. What they're trying to do is document, well, everything about Saudi Arabia, their history, their culture, everything.
Wow. Talk about a comprehensive project.
Right. And get this, it's available worldwide in multiple languages.
That's pretty incredible, actually. When I first, just the scope of this thing is mind-boggling. We're talking culture, history, the economy. They even have super detailed entries about things like geography and politics.
Yeah, and they're not messing around when it comes to sources either. I mean, they're pulling from places like the King Abdulaziz Dara.
Right, their national library.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And the Saudi Press Agency. I mean, you can tell they're really making an effort to, like, establish some credibility here.
Yeah, they're serious about it, for sure. It's not just, like, putting together a bunch of old textbooks and calling it a day.
Oh, absolutely not. When I was poking around on there, I mean, they have photos and videos. They're even using infographics. Like, it's clear they want to make this appealing and engaging for, everybody, not just academics hiding away in their ivory towers.
Definitely. It's very accessible. And while, sure, I'm sure academics are finding it useful, you're right. I think Saudipedia's goals are actually much broader than that. What they say is that they want to present a realistic view of Saudi Arabia, and they're putting this out there for a global audience.
Okay, so they're trying to shape global perception.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I think makes this really interesting, is they're very upfront about the fact that their selection criteria for what actually gets included in Saudipedia, what they choose to highlight, is heavily influenced by this thing called Vision 2030.
Vision 2030. That sounds familiar. Refresh my memory, though.
Yeah, no, totally. So Vision 2030 is basically Saudi Arabia's big strategic framework for their future. You can think of it like their roadmap for how they want to reduce their dependence on oil, diversify their economy, and modernize a lot of different aspects of their country.
Okay, got it. So like Saudi Arabia 2.0.
Exactly.
So are you saying that Saudipedia is kind of their way of showing the world, like, hey, this is the new Saudi Arabia, this is what we're all about?
Yeah, I think you nailed it. And to really hammer home this whole Vision 2030 idea, they dedicate a pretty significant portion of Saudipedia to showcasing these what they call national figures.
Okay.
Now, this is where I started to find some really surprising stuff. Like, for example,
Tell me more.
okay, so there's this one anecdote in there about, how they were really pushing to get more women involved in the tech sector. Like a big part of their whole thing is trying to break down those kinds of barriers. And there's this story in there about how basically this one woman, she had this really like traditional, family, very conservative, very much pushing her towards a more traditional role in society.
Okay.
And she was like fascinated by computers from a very young age. She was just obsessed with them. And her family was completely against it. It was a huge deal for her to even get permission to, take computer classes.
I see where you're going with this. So Saudipedia is using these stories to show how things are changing.
Yeah, exactly. So this woman, she ends up going to university for computer science.
Wow. Good for her.
Right. But then after she graduates, she can't find a job because at the time, nobody wants to hire a woman to be a computer scientist, which is just crazy, right? So she ends up starting her own software development company.
Amazing.
I know, right? And she ends up becoming wildly successful, like crazy successful. And her company, ends up employing, hundreds of people, a lot of them women. And she ends up becoming like this huge advocate for getting women into tech.
Wow. That's an incredible story.
Right, and it's a true story. Like, this is someone they highlighted in Saudipedia.
Yeah.
And the way they tell it, it's very clearly framing her as, the embodiment of Vision 2030.
Wow. So it really drives home the point that Saudipedia isn't just some, dry, boring collection of facts. It's more like it's a curated narrative.
Exactly. It's definitely deliberate. It's them saying, this is the story we want to tell.
This is how we see ourselves.
And where we're going.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. And for anyone who's interested in Saudi Arabia, I really do think it's a super valuable resource, especially since it's only going to get bigger, right? They're going to keep adding more stuff to it, more languages, more content. So.
Yeah. So it's like a direct line to understanding how Saudi Arabia sees itself and where they want to go.
Yeah.
Which I think is really cool. It's like you're getting a peek behind the curtain a little bit.
Totally.
So, the big takeaway here, if you ask me, is if you really want to understand how Saudi Arabia sees itself, Saudipedia is something that you have got to check out. I mean, you can't just take it at face value, obviously. But as a primary source, I mean, it's invaluable, right? Like, this is them speaking directly to the world. This is their narrative. Now, here's something I was thinking about while you were talking, and I want to throw this out to our listeners.
Go for it.
So they're choosing to emphasize certain stories, certain figures, right?
Right.
Like this woman, the computer scientist.
Yeah.
What does that tell us about the values that they're trying to project to the rest of the world? It's fascinating. Like, if those are the narratives they're highlighting, what does that say about what they want the world to see, to think about them as? Like, it's really made me think.
Definitely. I mean, it's a very deliberate choice. What they choose to highlight and how they choose to highlight it, it's definitely worth thinking about.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, it is.
Well, listeners, on that note, we highly recommend checking out Saudipedia for yourselves. And, let us know what stands out to you. What are your takeaways? Because, I mean, it's a fascinating look into a really interesting culture that's changing very rapidly.
And a culture that's trying to control the narrative about how those changes are perceived.
Exactly.
It's fascinating stuff.
So, till next time.
Keep digging.
We'll see you all later.